Hello, and welcome to this workplace safety webinar hosted by the Workers' Compensation Board of PEI. I'm Lori Wakeland, Occupational Health and Safety Education Consultant with WCB, and today our topic is on workplace safety for supervisors. Now, my email address will be on the final slide of this presentation, so if you want to jot down any questions you have as you go along, as you're viewing the webinar, and then send me an email after the session and I'll do my best to answer your question. Okay, first of all, WCB has several resources that you can access information through. The first is on our website. So you'll see our landing page here on the left of your screen. We are at wcb.pe.ca. Our health and safety portal is at the bottom where you can see the hard hat. And you'll also see at the bottom of that screen, Twitter and a YouTube channel link. So if you click on those from our website, you can feel free to follow us through either of those channels. We also have our app available through either Google Play or on the App Store. So if you want to download that on your mobile device, and you can access several resources as well that are also available on our website. So here's today's plan. We are going to have an overview of PEI's occupational health and safety legislation as it relates to our topic today, which is supervisors. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the internal responsibility system and what that means for everybody in the workplace. And then we'll get into the bulk of the presentation, which is on due diligence, and we can look at some ways that you can start to practice due diligence or recognize some ways that maybe you're already practicing due diligence well in your workplace. So PEI's, the Workers' Compensation Board of PEI administers the Occupational Health and Safety Act and the regulations. And so a lot of these regulations come out from the Act. They are the general regulations, fall protection regulations, scaffolding regulations, workplace harassment regulations, WHMIS regulations, and smoke-free places legislation as well. Again, these can all be found on our website at wcb.pe.ca. So you navigate yourself to our website, you follow the links for acts and regulations, and you can find the legislation that we administer. As supervisors, it's important to know that the legislation that affects your work, your workplace, and the workers that you are supervising. We'll talk about that later. So we're going to discuss the duties of an employer, and these duties are out of our Health and Safety Act for PEI under Section 12. And so I'll take a moment to go through these, and then we're going to talk about duties of workers as well. What you'll not see directly from our Act is duties of a supervisor. Now, some provinces across Canada are amending their legislation to include a supervisory component. So they're outlining clear supervisor responsibilities. We don't have that in PEI. However, as an agent of the employer, you do have many of these responsibilities that the employer has. And we'll see some examples of those as well as we go through. The first overarching responsibility is to take all reasonable precautions to protect the occupational health and safety of persons at or near the workplace. So this is kind of a catch-all. This is like, if you're an employer and you're tuning in today, make sure that you do this. You take all reasonable precautions. It's pretty broad, and we are going to get into a little bit more specifics with the next few bullet points here. So part of that is ensuring that any item, device, material, equipment, or machinery at the workplace are properly maintained and used. So if you have equipment, machinery, chemicals, what have you at your work site, forklifts, fall arrest equipment, hearing protection, whatever it may be, it's your responsibility as an employer to make sure that all of those are properly maintained and they're properly being used. And so what we don't want to fall into is the habit where our equipment starts to fall apart. We're not getting it inspected on a regular basis. We're not even, noticing when our gear starts to degrade a little bit. So it's important that you, as an employer, ensure these things. This is the big one that deals with supervisory responsibilities, and we'll analyze it a bit more in a moment. But ensure information, instruction, training, supervision, and facilities are provided for the occupational health and safety of workers. You're going to see this on a few slides actually during this presentation because this is a big one. So you need to make sure that your workers have information that on their job requirements. You need to make sure that they have information on the hazards they may be exposed to at work. And you need to give them instruction and training on how to protect themselves from those hazards and the processes to follow to make sure they're working safely. And of course, you need to provide enough supervision and adequate supervision that they're being kept safe. Okay. And the facilities is obviously in the employer's control. So make sure that your facilities are such that their workers are adequately kept safe. Ensure workers and supervisors are familiar with workplace hazards. So this is stated right in the Act that this is an employer responsibility to make sure that the workplace hazards are communicated properly to workers and properly to supervisors. And in order to communicate them, you have to know what they are. So making sure you're doing regular inspections and regular audits and regular just checks at the workplace, regular risk assessments, and then you're being made aware of the hazards through those processes and through your experience and your training. And then you make sure that you are familiarizing your workers and supervisors with those hazards as well. Ensuring workers are familiar with proper use of all safety features or devices, protective equipment, and clothing. So again, you're communicating information to workers, and this is a big part of duties of the employer, is making sure that workers have the right information. And if you thought you've given them the right information, you might need to give it to them again and again and again. So there are duties of workers as well. You can see that they're not as many because workers do not have the same level of authority that employers have on a work site, obviously, or the ability to make change. But there is this, again, overarching responsibility of every worker in the workplace, which is to take every reasonable precaution to protect their own and others' occupational health and safety at or near the workplace. Now, what this means is I can't necessarily control the hazards I'm exposed to. I can't control my employer's facilities. I can't control the work. Someone else directs my work. What I can control as a worker is my own behavior, my own actions, my own decisions, so that those actions and behaviors and decisions that I'm exhibiting are reflecting a safer workplace. So I'm not putting myself at risk, and and definitely not other people at risk as well as I'm doing my work. Also, as part of that, I need to cooperate with the employer and the other workers to protect the workers and others' occupational health and safety. So I need to cooperate with my employer. I need to cooperate with my coworkers, my supervisors, my committee members, and whatnot to make sure I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing to protect my own safety and those around me. Okay. I also need to wear or use individual protective equipment. So basically, if my supervisor has told me, you're going to be working at heights today, you have the training, here's the equipment, you know how to use it, let's get at it. So then we put on the equipment, I'm responsible to make sure I'm wearing it and using it. So there is some responsibility there, but this is also supposed to be reinforced by supervisors regularly. If you're seeing your workers not doing this, it is important that they wear or use their equipment, but again, it falls on the supervisor and the employer to enforce this if they're seeing it's not happening. Referencing back to our Occupational Health and Safety Act, Section 12(1)(c). We just talked about this on a couple of slides ago, but this is important. An employer shall ensure that information, instruction, training, supervision, and facilities are provided as are necessary to ensure the occupational health and safety of the workers. So this is where the supervisors are really mentioned. They get a shout out here in the Act. You got to make sure that there is proper supervision for workers. And what we're going to see in a case today, and in many cases I've read about over the years, I see that this is often where an employer will fall down. They're not giving the right information, instruction, training, and supervision to workers. And it's, what you don't want to do is neglect this and have yourself yourself in a situation where your worker is injured at the end of the day. And so you want to make sure that you're doing everything you need to be doing to protect their safety. So what is a supervisor? Our act, like I said, doesn't really make a whole lot of mention of supervisors, and it definitely doesn't help us to define it. So here's the textbook definition of a supervisor. It's a person who provides direction to workers on their work-related tasks. Now, in this orange box, you can see it can include any worker, manager, or employer, regardless of whether or not you actually have the title of supervisor in your position. So you can be a lead hand, for instance, and you might not be a lead hand every day, but today you are. And so as long as you fit into you're directing the work to other people, for other people, then you do carry that responsibility of a supervisor. So you're making the decisions, you have greater authority than the people who are looking up to you. Supervisor responsibilities must be outlined in the company's health and safety policy. So if you're here today as a supervisor and you're not 100% sure of your supervisory responsibilities for your company or for your organization, turn to your health and safety policy. Now, if you're a small enough employer, you might not have one, but the Act requires that every employer with 5 or more staff is legally required to have an occupational health and safety policy. We have some resources on that on our website if you're unsure of what that looks like, to help guide you through that. And so in that policy, there should be responsibilities outlined for you as a supervisor. So definitely go check that. Make sure that you understand it, and you can then be sure that you're practicing what you need to do as an agent of your employer to do proper supervision. Okay, let's move into the internal responsibility system. This system is what our legislation is really founded on. So it means that the responsibility for making the workplace safe lies with everyone in the workplace. So if you go back and think about the responsibilities that we just covered under the Act in those last few slides, you'll see how they kind of intricately work together. So you can be expecting your workers to wear their PPE because that's their responsibility. But they can also expect you to enforce it and to make sure that they're using the right PPE, that it's used properly. So you see how it all fits together. So the internal responsibility system does recognize that those closest to the work can provide valuable input in maintaining a safe workplace. What we don't want to do is have employees not sure of their responsibilities, and we don't want their voices to be muted. We definitely want them having a voice in the workplace. We want them to be able to give input into their work and what they can do to make their workplace safer as well, because they do the work every day. If the internal responsibility system is working well 100% of the time, our officers would probably have nothing to do. They would have no orders to inspect. They would have, if everybody was ever all doing this and everyone's in compliance, it would be a very uneventful world. However, just think about this. The more authority you have at work, whether it's making decisions, directing the work, what have you, you have the greater responsibility in this system, okay? So, for instance, employers are responsible for maintaining safe environments by providing adequate equipment and training about hazards and safe practices. Workers, too, are responsible to report safety hazards and follow safe work practices. We see in this image a worker who is a garbage collector who faces probably many hazards through the run of the day. And as an employer, you can't control this worker's um, workplace necessarily when they're moving all the time. Their workplace is their truck. You can control that, making sure it's inspected, making sure it's in safe working condition. But you can't necessarily control what they're going to face on their daily run. And so that's where workers do have that ability to report back to the employer any hazards they're seeing that you don't have access to, that you can't necessarily control, put controls in place for. This worker's wearing PPE, so the employer does have a responsibility there to make sure it's adequate and making sure the worker knows how to use it properly. Okay, let's get into due diligence. Due diligence can kind of carry a negative connotation at times when it's used legalistically, and we will talk a little bit about how that is used legalistically, because we think of it as a legal defense sometimes. What I want you to think about also is that it's a great concept. It influences your mindset when going about your day. So how can I practice due diligence today so that my workers can go home safe at the end of the day and we don't have to record any injuries today? So, how do you define due diligence? Due diligence for your purposes today as a supervisor, it requires you to take all reasonable steps to protect workers from harm. You'll see the word reasonable in there because um, you cannot necessarily control everything, but there are reasonable efforts you need to make sure that workers are protected from harm. And the employer carries the greatest control, of course. Supervisors get are authorized with some of that control as well. All reasonable steps, though, is defined as the level of judgment and care that a person would be expected to do under the circumstances. So picture yourself or another competent individual in your shoes with the same work experience, knowledge, and skills and training as you have. What decision would they make in the same scenario that you're in? Okay. So if you're looking around your work site and you know workers are to be wearing hearing protection, but you're seeing that they're not wearing them and you ignore that, that's a big problem. So you need to make sure you as a supervisor are taking all reasonable steps to make sure that those workers are kept safe. And some days it makes supervisors a little less than popular, but that's okay. You're in this position and you do have those responsibilities. So generally, when a case goes to court on workplace safety matters, it's because there are charges laid under our health and safety legislation. And when that's the case, the courts will look at the facts of the case, and each case would bring a different set of facts. And generally, they're going to focus on what you see here as these three big factors. And they're going to look at these factors and decide whether due diligence was applied in that particular case by the person who's being charged, whether it's the organization, the employer, the corporation, or whether it's a person. So the first one is foreseeability. So the question this asks is, could a person foresee that something could go wrong? So picture yourself again. You're looking at you're on the floor, you're with your workers, you're seeing that they're not necessarily wearing the protection they need to wear, or they're putting together some kind of a makeshift piece of equipment, which we're going to see in a case in a moment. Can you foresee, as their supervisor, with your knowledge and experience, that something could go wrong? And if the answer is yes, you need to act, you need to step in, okay? The second factor that courts will look at is preventability. And they'll ask, was there an opportunity along the way of this event, this case, to prevent an injury or an incident? So again, this is where your um, authority as a supervisor to make sure workers get the information that they require to do their job safely, and the training and the supervision comes in. Make sure that you are doing what you need to be doing in those areas to prevent something from going wrong. And if you can see an opportunity along the way where you could have prevented something from going wrong, but you didn't, you ignored it, that is a huge problem. Okay. And the last factor is control. This talks about who has the ability or the responsibility to prevent an injury from occurring. Who has that control that can step in and prevent workers from being exposed to a hazard or an unsafe act or what have you. So if you have control over the circumstances, over the case, over the scenario, the greater control you have, the more due diligence you need to practice, okay? Let's look at a legal case that went before the courts a number of years ago. This was in New Brunswick. So Desjardins was the worker versus Walmart. And the link is there, but you can Google this through CBC and you should be able to see the article that I have used to discuss this today. In this particular case, there was a young worker who worked part-time in the Walmart garage section. And one of his duties involved cleaning the garage bay floors at the end of the night. So some of the technicians there would use a floor polisher, while others would actually use just the old-fashioned buckets and mops. And the details kind of start to go wrong when we see what the case presents, saying that the floor polisher that this worker was using, and this worker was 17 years old, he did die from his injuries. I'll set that up. The floor polisher he was using was purchased by one of the other technicians at the store, and it was purchased at a yard sale, okay, and brought to the garage for use. So there's a red flag right there, and someone at some point probably should have stepped in to prevent the floor polisher from being used. Now, Walmart could say, and did say, I think, that they had not authorized use of this piece of equipment that was brought in from a yard sale. So what this led to was another series of events that meant the technicians were not trained to use it. And it did not kind of become part of their monthly complement for monthly inspections, unlike other equipment that they bring in that they do inspect monthly. But even though they said they did not authorize its use, the technician who bought it was actually reimbursed by petty cash in the store, and the technician's supervisor knew it was being used. So there's a few red flags there, a few points along the way where someone could have stepped in, someone with the authority could have stepped in and prevented this from happening. So things started to get very problematic at this point when we come to find out another technician had spliced an extension cord together and spliced it to the floor polisher, and a rag was wrapped around the cord. Now, in this particular case, when the worker was using the floor polisher, video surveillance did catch the event, unfortunately, and he was electrocuted and died. It also was not plugged into a grounded outlet, so there was no way to stop the current. So just to take you to the next slide, I just wanted to give you a snapshot of the charges that were filed against the Walmart employer itself and the supervisor in this case. The first three bullets were the charges that Walmart did face, and you will recognize the wording in these bullets as similar to the responsibilities we just covered a few slides back on legislated responsibilities. So Walmart failed to ensure that the floor polisher was inspected before use and repaired or replaced if necessary and maintained in proper working condition. and failed to ensure employees complied with the requirements of tool use. So they might have had all the policies in place that you could possibly dream of. But if people are not using them and applying them and supervisors are not enforcing them, then we're going to see problems. They also failed to ensure that electrical equipment, including extension cords, were suitable and maintained and modified in accordance to the manufacturer's specifications and appropriately insulated and grounded before each use. So that's getting a little specific. So you want to take into account, this is where your knowledge of the OHS regulations is important as well. Walmart also failed to take all reasonable precautions to ensure the health and safety of employees by permitting the use of the floor polisher with a faulty extension cord in the express tire and lube express area of the store. So this is your overarching fail to take all reasonable precautions. Remember, we saw that as well under section 12 of our own legislation. New Brunswick's legislation is quite similar to our own in many areas. So these are what their charges would be similar, of course, if this was in PEI. Now, there was 2 more charges against the supervisor, and those are the bottom 2 bullets: failed to provide a healthy and safe workplace for employees, and failed to inform employees of the dangers of using the floor polisher in the garage. So we don't have a lot of details about how much the supervisor understood about floor polishers and insulating and grounding, currents before on equipment before use, but nonetheless, that's where the charge is laid. So I just want to make sure that you can see where this can go wrong. And in this particular case, Walmart received a then groundbreaking sizable penalty of $120,000 fine. And I'm pretty sure we've seen fines higher since then. This was 10 years ago. And then the supervisor also received a fine, and albeit it was a bit smaller. Okay. Let's say we have a worker who is only 3 months working for a small construction company and helping to install trusses. He's asked to help guide the trusses while standing on an unguarded rolling scaffold 18 feet high. He has received training in fall protection, but no fall arrest equipment has been provided. Even if it was generally not worn on site. So you can kind of see some red flags here too. And first of all, we have workers working at heights. Sure, they've got training. That's one thing. That's one thing in this worker's favor. But the training is not a lot of good without having the equipment to back it up, as well as the employer who's going to enforce the application of the training. So if you're just sending your workers for fall protection training, confined space training, WMIS training, and today a lot of things are moving online, and so it calls into question how much information is being retained in the training as well. So if you're responsible for making sure those workers are trained, you also have to make sure they're applying their training, and when they're not, that you're stepping in. So this is an actual case. It actually is from PEI this past year. You can find it in a search of the Guardian. And in that particular case, both the employer and the supervisor were aware that a fall protection system was required, but did not take necessary steps to ensure it was provided. So again, the employer, supervisor were both charged. They were both fined in this case, and for not showing their due diligence. Okay, so the next few slides, we're going to talk about how you as a supervisor can practice due diligence on the daily. First one, know and understand the requirements of the OHS Act and regulations that apply to your work area. So if you've never looked at our Occupational Health and Safety Act or the regulations, It is very important that you navigate your way to our website, download those pieces of legislation. They are supposed to be posted in every workplace, by the way, and you can, it doesn't necessarily have to be paper copies, but you can actually make sure that your workers have access to that, okay? So we don't want to ever suppress workers' knowledge around health and safety. So find yourself in the Act and regulations, find the areas that apply to your work, and kind of review what you need to know for your work area. Next, ensure safety information is accessible to workers. So you want to make sure that workers are always being made aware of information that could affect their safety and what you're doing and what they can do themselves to prevent injuries. Identify and implement a health and safety representative or a safety committee. Every workplace with 5 or more staff have to have a health and safety representative. It is in the Act as a requirement. If you have 20 or more, then you have to have a full safety committee. Okay, so if you fall into one of those categories and you don't have one, it's very important as an employer to make sure that gets established and that you keep it up, like keep up the safety committee, make sure they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're meeting monthly, they're taking minutes, they have a rules of procedure and that kind of thing. Last bullet on this slide, establish health and safety policies and procedures and collaborate with the safety committee and workers. So you want to make sure that if there is a safe work procedure that workers need to follow, that you have that in place, workers know about it, they know where to find it, you train them in it, and even better, you've actually consulted with them before you've put it into action. So the workers know the work the best, like we said in a few slides back, and you are best off to be able to get the information from them about how they see themselves fitting into that safe work procedure. So you can write it with them in mind as well. Still on practicing due diligence. So you must make sure that tools and equipment and machines are properly maintained. So this should be within the control of every employer and possibly even many, many supervisors. If your equipment is kind of, turning dilapidated and you're not having people inspecting your machines, your equipment, your tools, you're not replacing them when you see that they start to have defects on them, the girding goes missing, nobody cares, that kind of thing. This is an important piece in making sure that you are advising that some kind of maintenance system be put in place for the equipment and machines and tools. Identify hazards through frequent inspections, checks, and audits. So if you are doing regular inspections, there is a webinar that I do on workplace inspections. And in that webinar, I talk about research out there that shows us that the more inspections, the more frequently you do inspections, the actual leads to fewer injuries. They found this in this particular research and put it out on a white paper. And so if you're finding you're having too many injuries, too many people aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing, get out there and start doing inspections, whether it's daily, weekly, monthly, more formal, less formal, it doesn't matter. Just get out and do them. Check the workplace, do your observations, have formal audits on the regular. So these are all things that are going to help you, help support your due diligence and help prevent an injury from happening. Implement controls for the hazards identified. So the previous bullet said we're going to identify hazards, but identifying them is only halfway. Actually putting controls in place to reduce or eliminate those hazards as much as possible is important. And here's that clause again I keep talking about. Provide appropriate information, instruction, training, and supervision. So again, if your workers are working with hazardous substances, whether it's chemicals, asbestos, whether it's tools, whether it's heights, extreme cold, extreme heat, you are responsible to make sure that they have enough information about the hazards they're exposed to and how to protect themselves through the instruction and training and the proper supervision. Now, you know that not every employee needs the same level of supervision. Some employees are very capable of working safely on their own without a lot of supervision, and others are not as capable, or new workers or young workers. They need a lot more guidance, they need a lot more supervision, they need a lot more intervention when you see them doing something they shouldn't be doing. So the key word here is appropriate. So providing appropriate information, instruction, training, and supervision as necessary to make sure your workers are safe. Last two things to do today to practice your due diligence is correcting unsafe work habits and enforcing the safety rules and discipline as necessary. This can be hard to do. Some of us just want to be liked, and we don't want to be unpopular when we come around to enforce the safety rules. But it is your job. It is how you're going to protect yourself, protect your employer, and protect your workers. Because at the end of the day, the biggest goal is to get your workers to go home safe at the end of the day to their families. And so if you're seeing unsafe work habits, step in, correct. If they're not coming alongside and they're continuing to break the safety rules, whether intentionally or not, and if it's repeated, it's probably intentional, then it's time to start disciplining as necessary. And there are processes to do that. And if you have an HR person, that would be a really good resource for you to tap into that when discipline becomes necessary. And lastly, keep records of employee training, discipline, and workplace inspections. So even though paperwork is a lot of work, as you know and I know, it's really important that if you're training workers, even a toolbox talk, it's great to write down who's there, what you talked about, have employees sign off. If you have to discipline a worker, make sure that's documented. When you're doing your workplace inspections, make sure they're documented. And the reason I say that is because sometimes if it isn't documented, it didn't happen, or people forget. We don't remember the details of it. So it's very important to figure out a way to do these things and keep records so that if you're asked maybe by an officer at some point down the road, and you need to show that, yes, I did my due diligence. I did what I was supposed to do as a supervisor, and it still fell apart. But hey, here's the records I have. I can show and demonstrate that these workers have the training they need, that they have the equipment that they need, that whenever they weren't wearing the equipment, I disciplined them. I stepped in, I enforced. And here's a record of all the inspections where we've identified hazards in this workplace. So it can be time consuming. I appreciate that, but it is important as part of the due diligence package. And having said that, this will be my last slide, is that due diligence is about ensuring that you have an active system that is being effective, not about filling boxes with paper. Due diligence is not about trying to prove you have it, but actually acting and working with reasonable care. So don't spend your time doing your paperwork because you need to prove that you've done your due diligence. That's a bonus, but the main goal is to make sure that you are applying your ability to act with reasonable care and precaution. Okay. All right. So I want to thank everyone for tuning into this webinar today, hosted by Workers' Compensation Board of PEI. Thank you for the commitment you're showing by tuning in and protecting your workers from health and safety. Please do contact me if you have questions, and I can work with your group, work with your team, work with you to get you any more information that you need to be able to do the the supervising, the safe supervising that you hopefully will be out there doing. So I'll leave this slide up for a moment. If you need to jot down my contact information, you can. And other than that, have a safe day.